Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing the CTE C700 Air from Thermaltake, which is currently on sale, and in the UK today this case can be had for less than £125, which for a case that looks this good seems too good to be true. But is it? Let's take a closer look. So as the name suggests, this is one of Thermaltake's CTE cases, which stands for Centralized Thermal Efficiency. And if you haven't heard of this before, this is Thermaltake's redesign of how airflow works in a case, with the aim of providing fresh airflow to your critical components in your PC, namely your CPU and your GPU. How they do it is they've rotated the motherboard around 90 degrees, bringing the CPU closer to the front of the case and the GPU closer to the back of the case, where each of them can get their own independent airflow. And then any hot air is exhausted out the top of the case. So does this actually work? We'll be testing this out in the thermal testing section of the video, but what I want to do first is give you a closer look at the case. So to remove the tempered glass side panel, there's a notch at the back and you can simply pull the panel out and then lift it up and away. And our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. If we take a look at the back of this panel, you'll notice we've got two perforated areas on them, and there is separate dust filters over each of these perforations. Taking a look at our front panel, you'll notice it has large perforations in it, indicating that this case is designed to maximise airflow. The front panel is held on with push pins, so it can simply be pulled away. Behind the front panel, we've got a full length dust filter, and if we go ahead and remove this, you'll see that Thermaltake have pre-installed a 140mm PWM non-ARGB fan. And you're able to install up to 3 140, 3 120 or two 200mm fans at the front of the case. Alternatively, you can mount up to a 420mm radiator at the front. And mounting your fans and radiators in this case is going to be really straightforward with lots of removable fan/radiator brackets. The one at the front is simply held on with 4 screws. Again, at the back of the case, we've got an airflow focus panel which can simply be pulled away. This time the dust filter is built into the panel, although it's fairly easy to remove it for cleaning. Again, you can see Thermaltake have installed another 140mm fan at the rear, and if we look at the orientation of the fan, it's actually set to intake. And the idea behind this is you're going to have intake at the back providing fresh air to your GPU, intake at the front providing fresh air to your CPU, and then all the hot air is going to be exhausted out of the top of the case. In terms of cooling compatibility, it's up to 4 140 or 4 120mm fans, or up to a 420mm radiator. And again, Thermaltake have simplified the process of mounting fans and radiators at the rear with a removable radiator bracket. If you are thinking of going with a custom loop, you'll be pleased to see we've got a pump reservoir bracket on the bottom of the case. At the bottom of the case, you're going to be able to mount up to 3 120 or 2 140mm fans, or up to a 360mm radiator. And again, we've got a removable bracket at the bottom. You're not going to have to worry about dust getting in anywhere in this case, and we've got a full-length dust filter at the bottom, which can simply be pulled out from the side. Moving up to the top of the case, and again, the toolless theme for removing the panels continues here, and our airflow focused top panel can simply be pulled off. Again, we've got a built-in dust filter to the back of the panel, and you can see we've got our third and final pre-installed 140mm case fan at the top set to exhaust. There is a removable fan bracket alongside this where you can mount up to another 140mm fan. Our final fan mounting location is on a removable bracket in the second compartment behind the motherboard, and it can accommodate either a 120 or 140mm fan set to exhaust, designed to help cool critical components on your motherboard. Taking a look at our front I/O, we've got a power button, we've got 2 USB Type A ports, a single Type C port, a separate headphone and microphone jack, and a reset button. So taking a look at the standoffs at the back of the case, you'll see that our motherboard is going to go on its side. And in terms of motherboard support, the case is compatible with motherboards up to EITX in size. While the case has absolutely loads of support for liquid cooling, if you prefer to go with an air cooler, you are still going to be able to fit a pretty large air cooler in this case, up to a maximum height of 190mm. In terms of graphics card support, your graphics card is actually going to be hanging in the upright position from the top of the case, and if we take a look at the top, you can see we've got 7 PCI expansion slot brackets. In terms of graphics card support, it's up to a maximum length of 410mm without a radiator installed at the bottom, although if you do install a bottom radiator, this is reduced down to 327mm. So because your motherboard has been rotated around 90 degrees, your graphics card is going to be able to plug directly into your motherboard, and its fans are going to be facing the rear fan set to intake, giving it the best possible cooling. Thermaltake were keen to make sure your graphics card is well supported, and there's one support bracket which goes behind your graphics card which is adjustable, and another one that goes either side, making sure your graphics card is nice and secure. If you're more interested in aesthetics than airflow and want to see the fan side of your graphics card when you look in the tempered glass panel, that is also possible. You simply need to remove the PCI expansion slot bracket at the top of the case. There's an additional one that comes in the case accessory box, which you need to fix a riser cable to. Although the bracket comes with a case, the riser cable doesn't. You simply drop this in from the top, and when you connect your graphics card up to it, you're going to have the good side of it on display. Moving into your case's second compartment, it's great to see we've got absolutely loads of space for cable management. And the case comes with plenty of Velcro cable straps and cable ties, and lots of cable tie down points. We've got plenty of rubber grommets running through to the main compartment. There's absolutely loads of drive mounting locations in this case. If you don't plan to mount a fan on the bracket behind your motherboard, you can mount a 3.5-inch drive here. And as well, we've also got 2 removable hard drive cages. If we take a closer look at one of these hard drive cages, at the top of it you're going to mount 2.5-inch drives, while at the bottom you can mount 3.5-inch drives. If you don't actually plan to mount any 2.5-inch drives in the build, you can go ahead and remove the 2.5-inch drive cage and mount a 3.5-inch drive on the top of it, as well as 2 3.5-inch drives in the drive cage itself. If you're happy with just 2 3.5-inch drives in the drive cage, you can keep the 2.5-inch drive cage on top, and in this you're going to be able to mount 2 drives in the drive cage itself with an additional 2.5-inch drive on the top. So that gives you a maximum drive compatibility of up to 7 3.5-inch drives, or up to 5 3.5-inch drives, and 6 2.5-inch drives. Your power supply is going to go down at the bottom, and the case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 220mm. There is a support bracket for your power supply, and this is adjustable depending on the height of your power supply. If you look closely, all the holes are marked with the length of the power supply. All you have to do is match this up with the power supply you're planning on using. So because the I/O from your motherboard and your graphics card is going to be facing up towards the top of the case, you might wonder how you're going to be able to plug the cables into it. So what you're actually going to have to do is route the cables through to the second compartment, and then there's a rubber grommet on the back of the case you're going to be able to route the cables out through. So what I want to do now is give you a closer look at the build I put together in the case. So now I want to move on to the thermals, and as you can see I've set the case up to maximise the airflow. So we had a 420mm AO at the front set to intake. We had our GPU, it's currently facing the front of the case now, but in that video it was facing the 3 140mm fans at the back where it was getting plenty of fresh air. We had 2 140mm fans at the bottom bringing cool air in and blowing all the air up, and 2 fans taking air out the top. I also installed 1 fan behind the motherboard set to exhaust. So our Ryzen 7 5800X3D idled at 40 degrees and reached a maximum of 79 degrees during a 10-minute IDA64 stability test. Our 7700 XT idled at 26 degrees and reached a maximum of 70 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise levels, we had an average noise of 41 decibels at idle and 54 decibels under load. So in terms of the temperatures, these were actually really good. The only thing I wasn't so happy with was the idle noise level. It definitely was louder than I was happy sitting beside. Not a big surprise, we've got 11 fans and they were all running on the standard motherboard fan curves. But given the cooling was so good, there's absolutely loads of room to tune the fans down to a comfortable level, and you're still going to have a pretty good cooling performance. All I simply did was switch the fan curves over to silent, and we took 8 decibels off the idle noise levels down to a very comfortable 33 decibels. So the next thing I want to do was have a look at the different fan options. So you'll notice I did install a fan behind the motherboard. So the first thing I did was test the thermals again without that fan. So removing the fan behind the motherboard, the only difference was that our GPU ran 1 degree hotter and we had 1 decibel less noise both at idle and under load. It is also important to say there was actually no difference to our motherboard temperatures with and without the fan behind the motherboard. For some reason it wasn't giving me VRM temperatures or any of the other components on the motherboard when it went into ADATA 64, so I wasn't able to comment on the VRM temperatures when that fan actually made any difference to them. But it doesn't seem like you're getting a big difference by adding that fan in at the rear. Next thing I wanted to do was test the effects of turning the graphics card round like it is now, where it's facing out towards the tempered glass panel. The reason I didn't do this for my original build was I was really keen to test Thermaltake's theory of CTE, and this almost seems like you're going away from that. The fans are no longer facing the cool air here, and actually, would that make a big difference to our temperatures? So in terms of our CPU and GPU temperatures, there was absolutely no difference at all. The one thing I did notice, we're moving the graphics card away from the motherboard. Our motherboard temperature under load actually came down by 2 degrees. In terms of noise levels, there wasn't really a significant difference. We had 2 decibels less noise at idle, but 1 decibel of extra noise under load. So that's good news. If you want to mount your graphics card with the fans facing the tempered glass panel, it doesn't seem to be a big problem in terms of doing it thermally. The cool air from the rear of the case is still getting into the graphics card and keeping it nice and cool. And probably the fact that the graphics card isn't actually blocking the air path to the motherboard, and actually you're taking the hot graphics card away from the motherboard, meant our motherboard was actually running a little bit cooler as well. There is a few downsides to mounting your graphics card this way. It mightn't necessarily look better. I thought this particular ASRock card looked much better plugged directly into the motherboard. But for some other cards, the Strix card I showed in the build guide looked much better with the fans facing the front. So it is going to be graphics card dependent. You are going to have to buy a riser cable if you want to mount your graphics card this way, so it is going to come at extra cost. The other thing is you can't use any of the support brackets that came with the case to secure your graphics card, but if you look here, it is actually reasonably secure in this position. The only other slight issue I had, there is a little bit of adjustment on this bracket and you are able to move it backwards and forwards in the case. This is a fairly small graphics card. I have it installed all the way as far to the back as it will go, but I did have some issues with not being able to straighten the tubes up where the graphics card is. And there is a USB cable coming out the left hand side of this AIO, and it was a little bit difficult to get plugged in with this relatively small graphics card. So I think if you were going to go with a really big graphics card in this position, it might cause some issues up against your AIO. But I think whether you decide to do this or not is going to depend on the aesthetics and whether you're happy with the extra cost. So now we come on to my experience of building in the case, and being such a large case, and when you actually removed the fan brackets at the front and at the rear, you had incredible access to the build. The motherboard being on its side, plugging in all the cables was really straightforward. And in fact, if you're a beginner, I think putting a build together in this case would be really straightforward. Again, installing your graphics card was really good access to getting everything plugged in as well. In terms of issues that I had, I did think the cables at the bottom looked a little bit untidy running up to the rubber grommets, but it was only afterwards I discovered there was a little cutout at the front down at the bottom, and that would have been a much better place to route those cables through. But all the other cables I was able to get tucked in and out of the way. When it comes to cable management at the back, I did have a little bit of trouble with the EPS cables. I wasn't able to access the cable tie-down points that easy over towards the rear of the case. And really what you should do is probably remove the hard drive cages, get your cables managed, and then put the hard drive cages back in again. And that would mean you're able to manage the cables a little bit easier. Because it was a temporary build, I was just happy pushing them in. Final thing to mention, it probably is worth plugging in your HDMI or DisplayPort cable and routing it through the case before you install a top fan above the graphics card. The top fan does come on a little door. You can remove 2 thumb screws and tilt it up to allow you to plug your cables in. But if you're doing the build, it makes sense to plug it in before you would install any fans at the top. But other than those few simple points, you shouldn't really have any trouble building in this case. So now we come on to what I liked about the case, and the first thing I like about the case is the looks. I think it looks absolutely stunning. I think that's a large part to the different components I chose. I think it all goes so well together. The airflow is excellent in the temperatures, and as long as you don't run all the fans in the standard fan curves and turn them down a little bit, you're going to have a cool and a quiet build, and a build that looks stunning depending on how you orientate your components. You're also going to have a build that is free from dust with good dust filtration on all sides. Really good to see that. And if you want to go with lots of drives in this case, Thermaltake have really got you covered with loads of hard drive support as well. I also think it's really good that they've given you the option to install your graphics card directly into the motherboard with the fans facing the rear of the case, or use the included bracket and rotate the graphics card round and have the fans facing the front. And I think it's the right decision not to include the riser cable. Not everybody's going to want to use this feature. I personally think this card looked much better plugged directly into the motherboard, so I don't want to pay the extra cost for a riser cable with this case, and having that as an optional extra was definitely the way to do it. In terms of the fans, the fact that they don't have RGB on it out of the box, I think that's a good choice as well. There is an ARGB version of this case, but it comes with a tempered glass panel on the front, which in terms of airflow would be a no-no for me, and I would much rather have this version. Again, if you do want to add an ARGB into it, I think what you could do with those 3 non-ARGB fans, you could have 2 of them at the top and 1 of them behind the motherboard at the rear. Put your AIO at the front. So in reality, all you're having to do is pick up 5 ARGB fans, 3 for the rear and 3 for the bottom to completely fill the case. So not as expensive as some other cases, and you can put the included case fans to good use where they can't be seen. So now we come on to the things I didn't like about the case, a couple of minor things and then one more major thing which may or may not be a deal breaker for you. In terms of the minor things, the first thing to mention is the front panel connectors all came as separate cables that you had to plug into various pins on the motherboard. And at the end of 2023, coming into 2024, I do think that these should be organised into a single cable to plug in to make things a little bit easier. In terms of the cables as well, they were actually black cables when we've got a mostly white case. And I did think white cables might have been a better choice. That also went into the rubber grommets. These were in black as well. So if you're planning an all-white build, you weren't really able to do it in this case given the amount of black that was in it. I personally do quite like the black and white theme to PC builds. The motherboard I used was mostly white but had quite a bit of black in it, so it went very well for this particular build that I was looking to do. But if you are looking for an all-white build, this probably isn't the case for you. So the final thing to mention, and probably the more major thing, given this case's design, with the I/O of your graphics card and also your motherboard coming up to the top of the case, this means that you're going to actually have to plug all your cables into the rear of your motherboard and your graphics card and route them through the case and bring them out the rubber grommets at the back of the case. 2 problems with this. One is the annoyance factor of it. When you want to add something in, you can't simply just plug it into the back of the PC because the motherboard is hidden behind the top panel, and also potentially some fans in the way as well if you're going into your graphics card. So what you have to do is take that off, route the cable through the case and plug it in. So that's a little bit annoying that you have to do that. The second thing is that you're going to need longer cables. So generally standard PC and mouse cables aren't going to fit. You're probably going to have to use extensions for them unless you're plugging them into the top I/O. And as well, if you've already routed all the cables in your desk, it's not going to be a simple matter of setting this on the desk and plugging your existing cables that were perfect to reach the back of the motherboard. You're going to need much longer cables to route them through the rear compartment up and in to your components at the top. So may or may not be a deal breaker. If you don't mind spending a little bit on some cable extensions and spend a little bit of time rerouting your cables, you can have a pretty stunning build at the end of it. So one last thing I want to do before I come on to give you my final thoughts on this case, and that is I want to put Thermaltake's CTE, or Centralized Thermal Efficiency Theory, to the test. What I want to do is move all the components and put them into another case, and I'm going to use the AMD O11 Dynamic EVO. I'm not going to adjust any of the fan curves on the motherboard, and I'm going to rerun the thermals to actually test, does this orientation and layout actually improve cooling compared to a really good standard layout in a case. So I've moved everything over to the O11 Dynamic EVO XL, and I've tried to keep things the same as much as possible. So I didn't disconnect the pump from the motherboard, so it's the same application of thermal paste, same mounting pressure. We've got our radiator on the side set to intake, and the fans are behind the case pushing air through the radiator into the case. We've got 3 140mm fans at the bottom supplying cool air to our graphics card, and I've put 3 exhaust fans at the top. They're the same 140mm ARGB fans. I just haven't plugged any of the ARGB in to save on time. Taking a look at our temperatures and comparing to the configuration without the fan behind the motherboard, in the O11 Dynamic EVO XL, our CPU idled 2 degrees cooler and it was 3 degrees cooler under load. Our GPU idled 1 degree cooler and it was a whopping 14 degrees cooler under load. In terms of noise, we had 1 less decibel noise both at idle and under load in the O11 Dynamic EVO XL. So in terms of those thermals, I think the big thing that stands out is the GPU temperature. And the big difference is nothing to do with the cases, it's to do with the GPU orientation. And some GPUs do just not like being in the upright position. When I did lots of my GPU testing in the original O11 Dynamic EVO, we had the same GPU with such a big temperature difference depending on whether it was mounted upright or horizontal. And again, GPU being upright in one orientation, if you flip it around and have the I/O at the bottom instead of the I/O at the top, one GPU will be very happy in one orientation and completely unhappy and overheating in the other. And this is obviously just a GPU that does not like being in the upright position with the I/O at the top. So you can check out my O11 Dynamic EVO thermal testing video. I'll put a link to it in the description, which covers the differences I got in the GPU temperatures depending on how it was mounted. And I think this is just exactly the same issue. So the most important thing I think I've found from doing this testing in terms of CTE that Thermaltake recommend is you're going to have to be careful with your graphics card. Some graphics cards will be absolutely fine in this position, and again, when I did further testing in the O11 Dynamic EVO with a different graphics card, I found the upright position to be the best cooling configuration for the particular graphic card. Other graphics cards will not like it at all. So that's maybe the first thing you should do before thinking of purchasing a case that has your graphics card mounted in an upright position. Is it going to work with my graphics card? And if the answer is no, you should probably look at a different case if you're not planning on upgrading your GPU. So we've now reached the point in the video where I need to tell you, should you go out and get this case? And as I've said, it's on sale at the moment in the UK, can be had for less than £125. And I think at this price, you're getting incredible value for money. You're getting a case that looks this good, has excellent build quality, has loads of room in terms of storing all your drives. You're going to be able to fit large modern components in them and keep them nice and cool and get the build running nice and quiet. And you're not going to get any dust in your PC with all the dust filters. So this really ticks every box. Like I said, the only downside is the need for slightly longer cables and the extra time it's going to take you to plug anything new in. But if you're aware of all that in advance and you like the looks of this, I can 100% recommend it. So if you are interested in doing a build in this case, I have made a full step-by-step build guide in it, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. If you have enjoyed this case review, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.